All right, welcome to the Mentionables Live. Today, we're going to see about some atheist videos. We're going to watch and maybe give you some live responses. In addition, we're going to talk a little bit about the coronavirus and
Nicely
what the
timed,
Christian
Paul.
response is. Don't worry, I'm not sick yet, but we're doing all this digitally, so we're doing our part to socially distant here, be socially distant here, and I hope everybody out there is as well. So let's dive in and start the conversation with some of that. So, what has just in general, what have you guys' feelings been? Oh, first, who's with me today? I've got down below me here.
Joel Furchess.
And over here to my left,
Clinton Wilcox.
and it looks like you're the patron saint of lost causes today.
I am, yes.
Wonderful.
I don't know if you have any Anne Berlin listeners out there, but if we do, they'll recognize that line probably.
Cool.
I don't recognize the line.
Okay. I'll have to send you guys a song. Anne Berlin is no longer around, but they were one of my favorite bands, one of my favorite modern bands when they were still recording and touring.
I remember them a little bit, but I was never really a fan. So,
there are not a lot of modern rock bands that can win my heart, but Anne Berlin managed to do it. I'm not really too much of a fan of much modern music. There are a few modern bands that are still around that I do like, but certainly nothing really in the pop realm, more in the modern rock arena.
Cool. And I saw that you were last week before the show. We were talking a little bit about the best '90s Christian albums, and you were given some thoughts on that. So, what would be your top 3 '90s Christian albums?
From Christian bands, DC Talk's Jesus Freak would definitely have to probably be, it definitely in the top 3, if not number 1. I'd probably put Bloom by Audio Adrenaline in the top 3, and let's see, what else was there in the? It's really difficult to get to put a top 3. I might list Anybody Out There by Burlap to Cashmere as maybe the number 3, or possibly, there's a, who is it? The Supertones had Supertones Strike Back, which is a great album.
Yes.
Although I don't know if I'd necessarily put it as one of the top 3, but Jesus Freak and Bloom would definitely probably be in my top 3. And maybe the an album by Jars of Clay might make the top 3. Maybe either their self-titled or their second album, Much Afraid. Both are great albums. Jars of Clay, very talented songwriters as well as very talented musicians. So, just kind of without having prepared a list beforehand, I would say off the top of my head, and in really no particular order, my top 3 Christian albums in the 90s, probably Jesus Freak by DC Talk, Bloom by Audio Adrenaline, and either Jars of Clay by Jars of Clay or Much Afraid by Jars of Clay.
Cool. Well, there's some recommendations for our listeners, especially the younger listeners who might not have been around for some of those albums coming out.
Yeah, and the thing is, I actually didn't even know there was a market for Christian rock music. I guess to give a little bit of my history, because I grew up in the church, and so I was always aware of some modern hymn writers like Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, people like that. But then in 1999, you probably all can't imagine me actually skateboarding, but I had some friends who skateboarded, and they actually took me out skateboarding one night. And I skateboarded a little bit. I had a much better sense of balance when I was in high school than I do now, because I gained weight and I've stopped exercising, that kind of thing. But we were out skateboarding one night, and one of my friends busts out a boombox. I might be dating myself here, but he busts out a boombox, throws in Jesus Freak by DC Talk, not just the album, but actually blasts the song. And I was like blown away. I was like, man, I had no idea there was there was Christian rock, or especially good Christian rock. And so from that point on, I started listening to Christian radio and trying to find as much Christian music as I could, because in high school I was listening to the modern alternative rock bands like Third Eye Blind, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Matchbox 20, Collective Soul, those kinds of bands. So Collective Soul obviously is kind of semi-Christian band, but yeah, that was kind of the stuff I was into in high school. So I was really kind of blown away when I first heard Jesus Freak by DC Talk.
I would say that Collective Soul definitely sounds like some kind of Eastern philosophy.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what they get the name from, but some of their songs are actually based on scripture. They have a song called "Shine," which is probably their most well-known hit. It's actually a prayer to God. Heaven, let your light shine down. They had a song called "Gel," which is actually based on a passage in the Old Testament. So yeah, and actually, two of the guys in the band are brothers. Roland, I forget if that's the first name or the last name, but they were preacher's sons. They kind of what's the name for it? I guess backslid quite a bit or something, but they were both preacher's kids, and so a lot of their songs were based on scripture and Christian themes, as well as other things.
So Clinton, what would people do if they found out you were Jesus Freak?
Well, it depends. Nowadays they either kind of shrug it off or think I'm a bigot. I guess. I don't know. I'm pretty open about my Christian.
Yeah, I think they probably already knew that.
So right, yeah, but yeah, I got that was a reference from DC Talk though.
Yeah, that was one of the first albums and songs that turned me on to decent Christian music as well, because most of what I'd heard up until that point was kind of the fluffy pop stuff that you still get a lot of today.
Right.
And, finding some more depth in things and diving in really helped me to keep some theology in my music at times.
Yeah.
I was a big Michael Card fan.
Michael Card?
Yeah. I have heard of Michael Card. I'm not really too familiar with his music, but actually...
I wouldn't call him poppy or rocky, but the theology was solid.
Okay, well, that's good. Also from a CCM artist. But yeah, so I came across this book back in the 2000s, which is like one of the greatest books ever written. I keep hoping that Mark Allen Powell will actually write and release an updated version of it. But it's the Encyclopedia of Christian Music, and it's very interesting about all the bands and singers and songwriters that it talks about, even those who have attained mainstream success, like Collective Soul and groups like that.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. I didn't even know that was out there.
Yeah, it's a great book. I guess I'll plug it for Mark Allen Powell. Wasn't expecting to plug that book, but he's actually a Lutheran. I know he's a Lutheran. I forget if he's a pastor or a music minister or something, or I think he teaches at a seminary too. But he actually came locally one day to do a talk, and unfortunately I had to miss it because I had a prior commitment that day. But I almost got to see him and have him sign my book, but unfortunately it just didn't work out. Still, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, if you're a music lover, definitely check that book out. It's jam packed with useful information, and it's also jam packed with interesting stories. I don't know if you ever heard of the Christian band PFR.
Was that Pray for Rain?
So. Yeah, it stands for Pray for Rain. After their first album, they had to shorten it to PFR because they faced a possible lawsuit from some organization called Pray for Rain that had trademarked that name, so they had to shorten it to PFR. And actually, they were actually on the way to what's the big music awards? Is that the Emmys or the Grammys?
Grammys.
The Grammys. They were actually on the way to the Grammys one day, and Weird Al Yankovic's limo had broken down. So PFR actually rescued Weird Al and gave him a lift to the Grammys. And they recommended that, hey, why don't you parody one of our songs? But of course he never did, because he parodies the huge stars from the mainstream arena. The closest he's gotten was he put a POD song and an Owl City song in one of his polkas, but that's because they had achieved mainstream success with it. But yeah, so PFR actually had a run in with Weird Al, who's one of my favorite singer and songwriters.
Well, isn't he everybody's?
I would hope so. That's almost as important as affirming the virgin birth. I think Nick Peters would affirm that too. So, yeah.
Speaking of, was your best friend born in a major?
Yeah, I hope that I hope you don't think me a stranger for that.
All right. Well, now that we've thoroughly confused the younger listeners with all our references,
yeah, I could talk about music all day. So, yeah.
Well, maybe we'll have to save that as a topic for one day as well, and actually sit down and discuss. We play love song, worship song a bunch, so maybe sitting down and thoroughly kind of going through and maybe look at some good theology songs and some bad theology songs. That could be a fun broadcast.
Yeah. Kind of a variation on love song, worship song.
Yeah.
Love song, worship song, the episode.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's your responsibility to set that up, Clinton.
Okay. Yeah, I'll set that up.
All right. Well, to move on to something less exciting, how are you guys holding up with the whole coronavirus situation? Are you isolated at home already? I know you probably are, Clinton.
For the most part, because I went to church today, and our church is coordinating with the city, and so we're making sure that everything's legal. They had an appointment with the city council, make sure we're above board, and we're keeping our services below 10 people as the CDC recommends. And essentially, there's just kind of a skeleton crew at the church, and we're live streaming the services. And I'm one of the church musicians, and so I was there. I didn't play for the contemporary service this week, but I did play the liturgy for the second service. And so I was there this morning. And so, I didn't play for the first service because I am trying to minimize the amount of time I'm out, because I do live with my dad, who is 60 and over, but he's also severely disabled. So, I help out running errands and help out around the house too, which is the main reason I'm here. But because I do live with someone who's that compromised, I have to be very careful about all of the time that I spend away from home. So I did go to church this morning for an hour or two to do that. And the rest of the week, unless there's like a grocery run we need to make or something, I have not left the house. And that's primarily the reason why. I myself am not too concerned about contracting coronavirus or even dying from it, because I've always been, remarkably healthy. And I, I'm just kind of the mind that, even though I'm not a Calvinist, I do believe that, my life is in God's hands, and if God still has a purpose for me here, I'll still be around. And so nothing, as long as I'm doing my part in trying to remain healthy, nothing will happen to me until, essentially it's my time to go. So I haven't been too concerned about it for my sake, but I have for my dad's.
Understandably so.
Yep.
How about you, Joe?
It's been somewhat productive for me. Of course, I go to school, so my first priority was getting that work done. And, we had to teleconference those things, so that was interesting. And then, it's nice to have time to get things done. But given that attention deficit disorder, I will start about 30 things and then not finish them. So not as productive as I would have hoped. But, it's also been nice to get time to spend with my kids. So that happened.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I've enjoyed that as well. It's been nice to have additional time at home. Anybody who could telework has been moved to telework in my industry, and it's definitely been challenging, as most of the folks I manage are older. So my staff's been slowly dwindling off, and I suspect that by the end of this week, I doubt I'll have many left in the office, but we shall see. It's been an interesting time to be alive, though, to see something really unprecedented for the last couple generations. And I think that's raised a lot of interesting dilemmas and questions and things that have come up for people. I actually received a question last weekend in talking about this stuff that's really interesting, and I'll kind of throw it out to you guys. I had a friend message me, and they were talking about their elderly father, and that he was dead set on attending services, and he is a devout Catholic. And so I did some research into Catholic doctrine, and one of the catechisms I was looking at actually talked about what a grave sin it was to miss Mass. I had no idea that it was regarded as a significant sin to miss Mass. And so I found that to be a really interesting dilemma from a Catholic perspective. Is, what do you do when you're put in a situation where your church is not abiding by things, and you feel it's a grave sin to avoid services?
Yeah, well, what do they do about confession, too?
Yeah, I think that was in the same boat.
Yeah, I'm very much Catholic friendly. I have a lot of Catholic friends, and being basically a full-time pro-life advocate, I interact with a lot of Catholics, and so, when I speak against some of their doctrines, I don't intend to do it in a way that's intended to be mean or hurtful or anything. But I think this is one of the areas, obviously, as a Protestant, in which I would disagree with Catholics, in that I do believe that we should assemble together. I think that there's scriptural warrant for that, and I believe we shouldn't forsake that. But I don't I don't think it's the kind of thing that would damn your soul, essentially, by missing that, especially if the purpose of it is to avoid spreading a dangerous disease that's at risk of infecting a lot of people. And so in this case, I do think it's a case of loving your neighbor to stay home. And a lot of churches, my own church included, are actually live streaming the services, which I think is a great thing. It's not ideal, if you're physically able to go to church or go to Mass, you should. But I think that it's not the kind of thing where it's where if you have a sufficiently good reason, you can't just miss a few days, especially if they're going to live stream it, so that you can still participate in it. You can still hear your pastor or your priest's message, but you're also trying to curb the spread of a viral illness that's going around, and that's very contagious and is also deadly. So yeah, I don't know, I don't exactly know all the nuances there regarding the Catholic idea of Mass, and I know that some priests have canceled services, and I think the Pope even spoke about this as well. So yeah, I can't really speak on it from a knowledgeable Catholic perspective. Obviously, that's just kind of my perspective, looking at it from a Protestant point of view. Is that I think that if churches can live stream, I think that if you're going to trust doctors to help make you well, rather than just praying and not seeing a doctor, which would be foolish, it's wise to go see a doctor. Even though you're praying, you're still trusting in God for healing. That's why we have doctors. Well, if we have the technology to be able to broadcast a church service, then I see no reason why, for a sufficiently pressing reason. Obviously, I don't think you should do it all the time, but for something like this spreading viral infection, I don't see why we can't just take advantage of the technology that we have in order to be able to attend church services virtually. And since we cannot, because it's a physical danger to other people, meet for service, I think I don't see anything wrong with taking advantage of the technology for that purpose.
Yeah, and I imagine that there's some, groups out there that are, that would say that we're not being trusting in God, or, you know, we need to ignore the worries of the world and just carry on as possible. We wouldn't, you know, otherwise we don't have enough faith in God to protect us, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
definitely have friends like that on Facebook.
I actually heard of a church in Tennessee that refused to follow any guidelines and held service this past week. And then one of the visitors to that church has now tested positive for the virus. So, you know, it's a bad situation, I think. And I've seen people who are up in arms because they see this as government coming in to control things and take advantage of the situation to shut down churches. But I think there's a lot more practical reasons right now to utilize technology and make some of these steps to make sure people stay healthy.
Right. Yeah. Because if we hold service and if we hold a service and one of our parishioners contracts coronavirus, then that seems, you know, it's not just unwise because you're risking spreading coronavirus to your parishioners, but it's also from a perspective of that, you know, essentially the world is watching, and how is this going to look to non-Christians that we're not willing to be safe, and we're willing to risk spreading infection to other parishioners, or maybe even guests to our church, because we didn't heed the government's warning. And now I have heard, you know, I know I have heard of a pastor who actually believes that this is a First Amendment violation, and says that we're now at the point where essentially going to church is illegal, and so he's gonna preach the word despite the fact that he could go to jail. And I don't think that's very wise, as I, you know, stated a couple times already. But also, I don't think this is a First Amendment violation. Now, I couldn't find my Constitution earlier because I was kind of in a rush to get to the church, but I believe that this is part of the constitutional power allotted to the government, because it's a public safety concern. So it's not, you know, the government hasn't passed a law to forbid the free exercise of religion. You know, the government is not violating the First Amendment here. They haven't passed a law to prevent us from holding services. They've temporarily closed down certain organizations and certain businesses which are not deemed essential, because they're trying to curb the spread of this viral infection. So I don't think it's a very good thing for pastors to kind of try and defy this law as if they're doing some great thing for the Lord by, you know, standing up to government or something. Because I think that I don't think this is the right kind of the right kind of situation to do that in.
Yeah, I mean, that's raises the question. The First Amendment gives us the freedom to gather. That's one of the things included in that. And so this thing with the government, do they have the right to arrest people for gathering, or you know, what would be the consequence of violating the current orders?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure. Oh, well, actually, I think this was in Maryland, and so I believe that they're actually. I don't know if they're actually under martial law at the moment, but one of my friends in the state actually posted that there were military vehicles on the street, kind of enforcing the shelter-at-home law. So here in California, I believe what would happen is you would get a fine. I don't think they'll actually throw you in jail, but I don't know about Maryland, because there were military vehicles. From what I gathered, there were military vehicles on the street kind of enforcing this. So I'm not sure.
I had heard rumors that he was thinking about declaring martial law. I don't know if that's happened yet.
The governor in California said that he will initiate martial law if he deems it necessary. So that's an open possibility here in California. It hasn't gone that far yet, but that's something our governor said. I don't know. You know, I haven't really been keeping up with other states because, you know, it's not really relevant to my situation here. I've just kind of gathered things from, you know, other articles that my friends have shared.
Yeah, here in Virginia, they've banned any gatherings over 10 people, and the governor announced that they would actively enforce this if any businesses were open and allowing more than 10 patrons if they were non-essential, and that it would be a fine and a misdemeanor crime at this point if they had any gathering of more than 10 people. But I think most of that's for theaters and that sort of thing. I don't think there's been any mention of churches directly in that, at least not in the press conferences I've watched.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like I said, my church is staying above board. They had a discussion with the church council, and they got an exemption, an exemption to the stay-at-home law because they're meeting for services. And so, we kept it under the 10 people that the CDC said, and we live streamed our service to the congregation. So we're making sure that we're taking steps to keep everyone safe, even though we're still, essentially meeting for church. So, yeah.
And I think that's a reasonable response. I actually think it's a great opportunity for the church in terms of being able to broaden the whole outlook. It's been kind of one of my pushes this year, is to really make connections with a bunch of churches in my area so as to, have it not be the church, but the church in the big sense of
Right.
of having connections that go across denominational lines and against, building lines. And I think that, something like this, if we utilize the technology as best we can, we could really change that up a little bit, and it would be a good chance to really expand and take something that's very, very, localized in one sense, and maybe take some of these same practices we have locally and expand them to a different kind of level. I'd love to see online, discipleship groups and that sort of thing shape and take form in a way that I really haven't seen up until this point.
Yeah, so if we're on that subject, I follow a number of atheist feeds because of the study that I'm doing, and one of the feeds today was talking about, dealing with sort of end times, apocalypse, anxiety due to the current events. I haven't seen any Christians posting anything about end times. Have you guys?
I've seen maybe one or two, not very many.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. A few people, a couple of the more fringe groups of people I'm involved with. I've seen a couple posts there about this being an end time or a judgment, but a lot of those have veered off down even these secular conspiracy theory roads, more so than being tied to scripture. Although there is a scripture I've seen brought up a few times now that people have referred to. I'd have to look up what it was. I think it was maybe Isaiah or Ezekiel. And people have referred to that and the locust plagues in Africa, and kind of tried to tie all this together to say that this is a prophecy for right now.
Yeah, I've thought it was kind of, I don't know. I don't know if funny is the right word, but coincidental, let's say, that all of these things are happening in relatively the same proximity. But that does not mean that I'm going to, go the apocalypse route. I avoid doing that at all costs.
Right.
Why is that, Joel?
Because in the end, that's fodder for, the types of people that we deal with, to, show how Christians are, I don't know, alarmist and prone to conspiracy theory and, unrealistic and so forth. But also, it's been my approach to end times type thinking that it's not something that we would ever be able to predict accurately, at least. And that the best, my approach is A, it's not predictable, and B, things are going to get worse before they get better. And those are the only two things that I'm going to take a stand on.
Well, if you're going to take a stand, those aren't bad points to take a stand on.
So you're not going to give us an end times prediction, Joel?
Nope. Not even slightly. Are either of you guys preterists?
I have actually embraced partial preterism.
Okay. All right.
I'm not like 100% gung ho to that position, but that's sort of the position that I've kind of gone to taking.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it to embrace nor dismiss it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have a firm stance in that regard either. I think that there's a lot of things that are really interesting to study and get into, but this is not one that I've put a lot of time into yet.
Yeah, I haven't either. The main reason for it is simply because, I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and so, we were all about that rapture life. And so I was a pre-trib person for most of my life. And then as I've just studied the scriptures and studied different interpretation techniques, not like in a new agey kind of come to your own interpretation on it. I mean, more like, reading books by D.A. Carson and scholars on how to properly interpret scripture. And I've kind of come to the agreement that that the rapture as believed by Baptists and as made popular by guys like Tim LaHaye and the author of Late Great Planet Earth, whatever his name was, those guys, the whole rapture end times theology, probably not taught in scripture. So I've kind of gone the partial preterist route. I still believe the Lord is coming back to reign for 1,000 years, those kinds of things. But again, I'm not 100% I'm not so certain or I don't believe it so intently that I would positively think that a pre-trib rapturist would be wrong, essentially. So I'm not that sold on it, but that's kind of where I'm leaning.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is such a big deal to certain segments of the church?
I don't know.
Yeah, because there are groups that take this so seriously, and they're willing to go to the mat for
Right.
their particular approach to this.
Yeah.
And I'm not certain why.
I don't know.
That's a hard one. I think a lot of times end time views are very tied to a almost cult mindset, because we see that in a lot of the cults. They all have very specific end time views. It's happening soon, predictive dates, that sort of thing. And so I think there's something appealing about it to people, about having at least thought that they have a grasp on what the future holds and what's going to happen around the corner. And it also helps, I think, with a mindset of not worrying so much about what's currently going on and the impact you're having on the world. If the world's going to end tomorrow or next week or next year, then I don't have to be as concerned about what I'm doing now and what my impact is on the world, and because it's all going to come to an end. And I think that can be appealing from a mental security kind of stand place in an odd kind of way.
Well, let me come back on that with you. In the study that I do, I encountered something that I'd never run into before, and it's interesting to me, and that is rapture anxiety. And so rapture anxiety, basically, it's something that you see in children and possibly teenagers more than anyone. And it's this idea that what if the rapture were to occur and I'm not part of it? I'm left behind. Suddenly my friends and my parents and everyone I know is gone. And, I'm then doomed to live through the bad part. And, I don't have a relationship with God or whatnot. So it's this fear that the rapture is going to happen and I'm not going to know about it. And then I'll be left behind and everybody I know is going to be gone. And people who, children who have this, what you see with them is this sort of anxiety of being, too far away from, parents or friends or anybody they know. They don't like to be alone. And there's this kind of constant rededication of themselves and like saying the sinner's prayer over again, and sometimes like getting baptized several times, which is really interesting to me that that's a thing. Had either of you guys ever heard about that?
Not particularly, no.
Yeah. I'm sure I have.
I don't know. I mean, it might be directly related to like the Left Behind books and sort of this over emphasis on end times and rapture and so forth that started to happen in, I don't know, the 80s or 90s.
Yeah, Hal Lindsey, I think, was the name of the guy who wrote Like Great Planet Earth.
Yeah. So, and then I find in what I've started calling the modal typical churches, which are churches that fit a particular kind of profile in terms of the way that they teach and the kinds of values that they hold, that this is a real kind of fixation that they have is end times and the rapture. It's this whole be sure to evangelize everyone because otherwise they'll be left behind and there's nobody available to evangelize at that point. And, all these preachings on end times and the rapture and so on and so forth.
I think, too, one of the things thinking back to, around the time the whole Left Behind series came out and that sort of thing. And, of course, there were a good number of movies that touched on those topics.
I have quite a few of them.
Yeah. And even before that, I believe it was Billy Graham that did a book approaching hoofbeats, I think about 10 years before all that.
Yeah, believe it or not, I have an end times movie with Mr. T in it.
What?
Yeah, there was a quadrilogy of movies called Revelation. It was like Revelation, Apocalypse, Tribulation, Judgment, I think were the names. And Judgment, I believe, was the one with Mr. T.
Wow.
So, yeah, just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. Actually, I'm kind of surprised at how many... actually, I think Mr. T might consider himself a Christian, but I'm actually kind of surprised at how many non-Christian actors have actually appeared in Christian films.
Yeah, that's true.
Money's money, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so.
What I was, the point I was going to kind of make to come back around to it was, I think that when some of these books and materials and movies came out, people may have found it easier to gravitate towards that for developing a theology than actually reading Revelation. And because it's a complicated book, and you can throw in a couple commentaries along with it, and you're still going to be left scratching your head in the end. So, it was easier, I think, for people to gravitate towards fiction for developing a theology that way. Oh, these people must know what they're doing, so I'll follow that. I think kind of the same way we see some doctrines developed from stuff like Dante's Inferno. So, that had such an influence on how Christians viewed hell that, I think it's easier in one sense to just take a nice fiction work and let me trust this for my theology than actually trying to dig down and study and find out what's actually being said.
Yeah.
Well, to a degree, one of the characteristics of modal typical churches is isolationism, meaning that you kind of eschew and keep away from all of the things of, quote, the world. And so as a result of this, they try to replace, worldly things with the Christian version. So instead of going out and seeing R-rated films, you go and see Fireproof or The Prayer Closet or something like that. And instead of listening to pop music, you listen to Christian music. And instead of reading, Stephen King, you read Left Behind. And so because there's this sort of distancing yourself from any kind of entertainment that is produced in the secular realm, you end up focusing on any kind of Christian fiction that you can find. And since this was a big deal in terms of Christian fiction, it may have had a larger effect than it would otherwise have had.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate. And I think a lot of that comes from, how people treated, the early days of Hollywood as well. There was this separation between, Christianity and Hollywood in a way that, you keep that TV and radio and all that stuff, you keep that over there. And so I think that probably started a long, long time ago, and that distancing just drove a wedge to the point that it's taken many years to come back around and see that entertainment itself is not bad. And because it's taken so long to come back around, instead of being influential on the kinds of entertainment we have kind of this separate independent area of Christian music and movies and all that in that way you were describing.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's a conglomeration of things that kind of make that as big a deal as it is. And it's among the things that I kind of keep away from in terms of the type of study and preoccupations that I have, because, partially because I've seen the damage that it's done.
Yeah. And I think when you do too much of that, you get in this habit of picking up too much of your understanding of things from media. So if Left Behind's where you're getting your, end time theology, where are you going to look to for, your understanding of general Christian doctrines, movies, popular books, the Enneagram, I mean, it's bizarre, but it is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is that you don't think we're at the end of the world.
Well, I wouldn't know that for certain, but my leanings are in the direction of, no, this is not the end of the world.
Well, I think in any case, we have to live like it isn't. Whether it is or it isn't, we've got to keep on trucking, and we've got to keep moving on.
Yeah, because even even if the book of Revelation is unclear, we still have clear teachings about the Lord coming again. We don't want to be caught unprepared like the virgins that didn't have oil for their lamps, those kinds of things. So we want to at least keep the clear teachings in mind.
Yeah. So on the other end of things, I'm seeing people who would, they're Christian, but I would describe them probably, this is the crossover in the Venn diagram of conservatives and Christians. And that is people who are saying that this is all overhyped and that it's not as big a deal as they're making it. And, it's in that sense, I think it's a distrust of government and media that's creeping in there, that, just because this is being hyped by government and media, it's probably not as big a deal as it's made out to be.
Yeah, I'm seeing a whole lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm a conservative. I don't trust the government. That's why I'm a small government guy. But it's not just the government. We have doctors who are saying, doctors and other specialists who are saying that it's a big deal. We need self-isolating, and it's the government who's saying, okay, we're going to require you to isolate. And so, so it's not the government blowing this out of proportion. It's there might be a discussion about whether or not the government is overstepping its bounds here, but we do have medical professionals and scientists who are essentially saying that, yeah, this is a big deal. We need to take steps to curb the spread. So.
Yeah. And, I mean, it may be targeting, I'm sorry, more affecting people over the age of 60, but that probably includes all of our parents, right?
Right. Yeah.
Certainly our grandparents. So, for the people that we love, it's best not to be irresponsible or cavalier.
Right.
One great thing I read this week was actually a quote from Martin Luther, because there was a plague that rolled through back in 1527, and Martin Luther's response in a letter to a friend was, "I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed, in order to not become contaminated and thus perchance inflict and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he shall surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me. And so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but shall go freely as stated above. See, this is such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy and does not tempt God." I think that's a pretty nice summary of a Christian response to these type of situations.
That's pretty amazing. What years did Martin Luther live in?
I don't know that offhand, but this was in 1527 that this was written.
Huh. Yeah, see, he has this concept in that quote of, not going to places where he's not needed, which seems to indicate that he had this idea that, the idea of infection and so forth. But that seems like it would have been before germ theory. So, there wasn't this awareness of infection and quarantine and so forth back then. But I guess there was. I don't know. That's confusing to me.
Well, as Abraham Lincoln once said, don't believe everything you read on the internet.
Yeah. Well,
and
I mean,
for reference as to where this is, just so readers or listeners can look it up on their own. This was I don't know what volume of what this is, but it's on whether one should flee from a deadly plague, to Reverend Dr. John Hess. So that is where it's at least from. So listeners can look it up and see that I'm not off my rocker. But I agree with you. I think it's really, really on point, considering what we think of as a very limited knowledge of some of these things. But I guess even then, if a plague's going around, people are bound to notice that you're getting this from somebody else at some point. It's not something that's just wiping everybody out. It's somehow passed from person to person.
Okay, so germ theory began to be developed in the 14th century, around the 1540s. So yeah, I guess it coincides.
Yeah, so still pretty early. That would have to be on the cutting edge of probably what was understood at the time. Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was, reading up on the Black Plague, and the plagues that were taking place in the Middle Ages. And at that time, of course, it was the theory of humors and the theory of miasma, which is that bad air caused disease. And you see some in that quote where Luther says, "Purify the air," but then he's talking about restricting his movements. So I don't know. Seems like he might have had some awareness.
Yeah. And hey, if it was good enough back then to socially distance, then I think it's probably good enough now, or at least a start for things. Because, like you said, I see a lot of people who aren't taking this seriously, and that's really dangerous, especially if we look back 20 years from now and realize that, man, I was out and about doing stuff, and who knows how many people I gave this to, how many deaths I may be responsible for at some level, versus knowing you did everything you could to help others out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we do have germ theory now. We don't have the excuse.
Right.
Yeah, so well, any other thoughts on the current situation? I think we covered a lot of ground of a lot of the things going on out there right now.
Yeah.
No, that's all I got.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll come up again at some point because,
probably.
I was saying that I was scrolling through my feed, and it looked like about 60% of my feed was related to the coronavirus situation.
Yeah, there's not much way around it media wise. It's everywhere, and for good reason. I mean, this is an exciting time to be alive. I think the world's going to look a lot different here in 18, 24 months. Might be seeing a lot more online meetings versus in person, a lot more telework, a lot less social interaction.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll see flying cars anytime soon, but
as Elvis might say, a little less conversation, a little more action.
Yeah, perhaps. So, before we kind of roll off of here, the promise from the thumbnail for anybody who clicked on the video was that we would be looking at some atheist videos.
Oh, and it looks like we may have lost Caleb. Looks like we definitely lost Caleb. There he is.
I'm back. I don't know what happened there. That was scary for a moment.
You're back.
We missed you.
Oh, sorry, that's your front.
Yeah, so the promise of this video is that we take a look at some atheist videos on YouTube or online somewhere, and give some live responses to that. So, with that being said, I've got one. I think we started going through this one last time, since we took up a good bit of time with our discussion on music and the virus. We won't spend too much. My computer has decided it really doesn't like what I'm doing right now.
Oh.
So I don't know why it kept doing that to me, but it is not a fan of me trying to bring up any other videos right now, apparently. So I can try this, but I can't promise that I won't disappear again.
All right.
So last time we made it only a few, I think we made it like 25 seconds into a video by Hermit Meta on the Atheist Voice channel. And we covered a few of those questions on our last live episode. So listeners are encouraged to go back and check that out. It took forever to get through just a little bit of it. But
how long is the video?
The video is a grand whopping total of just under 7 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So, but he crammed 78 questions for Christians into this video.
Mm-hmm.
So very impressive.
Yeah, I know, right? So I'm going to start this thing, and we'll see if we can't cover a few of these and just touch on them briefly. For maybe the next 15, 20 minutes. And then if we don't have any live questions come in, we'll go ahead and call it a do. But we'll at least give people some of the content they've hopefully clicked on this waiting for. So after listening to us talk for this long, we'll let them hear somebody else talk for a minute. So if I disappear, this video may just play forever. I don't know if it'll kick off the video along with me. So y'all might have to just talk over him if I disappear again. All righty. All right, and I think I fixed some of our playback issues, so hopefully this will play without too much problem. So
if this doesn't work, I got you covered with ones I can read.
All right, fantastic. All right, well, let's give this a try. I want to make sure I don't go too much into what we didn't cover last week. So let's start it off here. Maybe.
Burning in hell. Would you be happy in heaven if someone you loved was in hell? If your son...
All right. Did we get to that one last week? Would you be happy in heaven if someone you loved was in hell?
Well, I wasn't here for the question, so I don't know.
I want to say we did.
I think we touched on that one, or at least we touched on some of the hell questions. So let's see what next one is here.
Was in hell. If your son or daughter were dying, and I hope that never happens, would you just pray for them, or would you take them to a doctor? And if you say you...
All right. So if your son or daughter were dying, would you just pray for them, or would you take them to a doctor?
Do both. Which one do you think has more of an impact?
And which one has more of an impact?
Okay. Well,
thoughts?
First of all, it's kind of a self-American, I don't know, straw man-ish approach to the way that Christianity and prayer operates. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would, like I said jokingly before we started the broadcast, why not both? Christians believe in prayer, but we also believe in taking action. Throughout Scripture, God works through His people. So, yeah, we can pray, but a Christian who prays and does nothing else, unless it's physically impossible to do anything else. Like, I can't do anything about the Christian martyrs dying for their faith in China. All I can do is pray for them. Maybe I could donate some money to the to Voice of the Martyrs or something. But as far as actually affecting that situation for the better, the only thing I can really do is just pray. But when it comes to a situation like if I or a loved one gets sick, yeah, pray for that person, but also take that person to a doctor. That's what we have them for. And Jesus affirmed that. He said, it's not the sick that need it. It's not it's not the well that need a doctor. It's the sick that need one. So, so do both. And as for which one is more effective, well, I don't think it's necessarily a competition, because the doctor, if the doctor can make me well because he or she is specifically trained in the art of medicine. Now I don't, I wouldn't say that God never works miracles. It's possible someone has an inoperable tumor that God could miraculously heal that person's tumor. So this is just kind of, putting two things in conflict, which really are not in conflict. And, I think if a Christian has a proper view of theology, they wouldn't put prayer and action in conflict, because both are effective ways that a Christian can work, essentially.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that, and I think this overall can apply to a number of different issues. But had Jesus just came and given us, advanced medical knowledge, it would have saved more lives over the course of history, or whatever the case may be in terms of preserving life. But that was not his mission here. His mission was to give this bridge to a relationship with God the Father. I mean, that's what he was here for. He never denied medicine. As you said, he affirmed it, and he didn't leave us with advanced medical knowledge because that was not his mission here. But it doesn't mean that we should neglect medicine by any means. I think that's something we've been blessed with, especially over the last 100 years. The advancements in medicine have been tremendous. And I think that oftentimes miracles can be helped through that, in terms of, given the modern era we live in, is it or is it not a miracle that people can be healed of things that surely would have been a death sentence, 100 years ago? And I think in a sense that is a miraculous act of God to allow us that at this time, to have that understanding. It's not a miracle per se in the sense of, a violation of natural law, but it is, I think, a miracle in the other sense of this is something that wouldn't have been possible many years ago. So I think that the two definitely go hand in hand. When I had a retinal detachment 4 or 5 years ago now at this point, I had ignored medical care, not knowing what was wrong with my vision, and didn't get this repaired right away because I had no idea what was going on. A year later, when I went in, they said, "Oh, you've got a detached retina. This is not good." So they scheduled me for surgery the next day, but my small group also prayed for me. And this was a scenario where they said, with how long you've had this detached, chances are you're going to permanently lose vision in that eye. But they did the surgery anyway, and we continued to pray about it. And, a year later, after everything had adequately healed, I had almost perfectly normal vision in that eye again. So, it was not a either or situation. It was a both and. And I think the same applies to most situations.
Well, let me kind of jump in and tell you why I think this is sort of a mischaracterization and sophomoric approach. This is not unlike saying, if you are starving and there's a bakery across the street and, you have the funds to purchase food at the bakery, would you pray to God to, miraculously put food on your table, or, fill your stomach or stop you from being hungry? Or would you go across the street and purchase things at the bakery? And if you did both, which do you think was more effective? he's pointing you to a situation where there is obvious help available for the situation, and then creating this, what I would say is a false dilemma of saying, you've got the option of doing one or the other, looking for a miracle or taking advantage of the practical help that's currently available. So yeah, I mean, it's a false dilemma, and it falls afoul of this whole idea that God doesn't have to act miraculously if he's made the help available through some other means. And if you happen to be a person in a situation where you've got a medical problem, and then there just happens to be a doctor available that's a specialist in that medical problem, and you pray to God to fix your problem miraculously, you're ignoring the fact that there's a good chance God put that doctor who can handle your problem there as a solution to your problem. Right. Nor do I recall Jesus or anybody else ever preaching that you should ignore practical means or solutions to your problems and instead look for miraculous ones. So there's that. And then, the other thing is I tend, this is not a firm stand I take, but I tend to have cessationist leanings, which means that these sort of, outlandish miracles, or at least obvious miracles, are not a thing that happens anymore in the modern day. I'm not ruling out the possibility of miracles, but I do think that you would see much less of this. And if you pray to God for provision, there's a good chance that those provisions are going to come through practical means. So, if the doctor's available, you're kind of ignoring the, help that God has put there for you in the first place.
Right.
That's true, and I think that often God has set up things that lead to His will being fulfilled, but it's through people. It's the same thing with salvation, in that none of us can get someone saved, but we are given an opportunity to be a part of that work, and be involved in the fulfillment of God's will. So I think that applies here as well.
Yeah, I think this is a false dilemma. And this is the same thing as saying, either God or science. If science has a solution to the problem, then obviously not God, therefore God doesn't exist, which again, is false dilemma.
Yeah.
He seems to set up a lot of those with these questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you can do if you load questions and shoot them off rapid fire in a video like this. They can sound a lot more convincing than they actually are if you stop to think about them for 2 seconds.
That's the other video I was thinking of. We've got one by Pine Creek out there where he throws out some questions too. We'll have to take that one on next time.
Okay.
Pine Creek.
Yeah.
Is he
that guy.
Mm-hmm.
Is he the street epistemologist guy?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Arch nemesis of Mark Lambert.
Oh, Mark Lambert? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to have Mark on for that episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, he and Mark interact quite a bit, and they're not exactly friendly towards one another.
Okay.
I was on his show one time.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. He interviewed me about the deconversion research that I do.
Oh, okay.
I'll have to throw a link in that in the description for that once we're done with this as well.
All right.
We mentioned it on last one. I think I forgot to throw a link up, so I'll throw those links in the description once we're done. All right, let's take on another one of these. See if we can get through one or two more before we wrap up.
Whose prayers does God answer? And if it's ultimately God's will, what happens? Why even bother they're praying. If you have
Okay, so whose prayers do God answer? And if it's ultimately God's will, why even bother praying?
Well, God answers whomever's prayers he wants to answer. That's part of being God. But as is commonly said, God's not some genie in a lamp where he can just, make a request known and then it happens. Um, you know, yeah, there are very specific guidelines in Scripture to have your prayers answered. Things like repetition, um, like the I think it was the widow who was approaching a judge, constantly pestering him about her request, and God said, you should be like that. And he also said things like, keep knocking and the door will be open, keep seeking and you'll find, etc., etc. So there are very specific guidelines to getting your prayers answered. So if God doesn't answer you right away, you're supposed to keep petitioning. And yeah, God has several answers. It might be the affirmative, might be the negative, or might be something in between. So yeah, God just answers whomever's prayers he deems proper to answer. And yeah, if it's all according to God's will, well, number one, we're God's children. So God wants good things for us. And so if we have a petition for God, we can ask him and then he could will it to happen. And so, again, another kind of false dichotomy, like Joel was talking about last time, because, it's not that either we ask or God's will is done. The thing that we ask for could be God's will, or God could will to answer our prayer if it's something that we're petitioning him for. So yeah, it's just, there's a whole theology of prayer, and these questions kind of have complicated answers that aren't really not really something you can put together in a 5-second response.
Yeah, so as far as whose prayers God answers, I would say that it misrepresents or misunderstands the nature of prayer, because prayer is one talking to God, and God is not a vending machine or Santa Claus in the sky. God is this individual. He has powers to answer prayer, but he's not necessarily going to simply give you whatever you ask for. And so this idea of whose prayer does he answer kind of presents prayer as nothing but requests for things from God, and prayer properly understood is talking to a person, not simply asking for things. So it kind of represents the nature of prayer. As far as the second question goes, this is one that always makes me chuckle a little bit. This idea of, well, if God knows what's going to happen anyway, why even pray? Well, God also knows that you're going to pray. He knows what you're going to pray for ahead of time, and so he interacts with the prayer. I mean, it would similar to say that if God already knows that a train is going to crash, why stop the train? Because he knows the train is going to crash ahead of time. Just because God knows about the prayer prior to the prayer being said doesn't mean the prayer hadn't been said. God wouldn't know about a prayer that you never said. So it's just kind of confuses the cause and effect chain.
Right. And I think it hinges really on two misunderstandings. One, the nature of God, and two, the nature of relationships. I mean, I can tell my wife I'm going to go buy a new car. But if I don't, involve her in a conversation about that, it's not going to go as well for me. And I think that's part of the nature of relationship is having interaction. Even if ultimately God knows how that's going to play out, that relationship in itself that prayer can bring is really one of the keys to this, because it enables that relationship to continue, versus being merely that genie in a bottle that Clinton referenced. All right, let's give one more here. Yeah, I got time for one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been talking for about an hour now, and we haven't had any interactions, I take it.
No, I've seen a couple of viewers pop up. I had somebody message me privately and said they were watching and enjoying it. I asked if they had any questions. They didn't have anything off the bat, so they were just enjoying listening.
Well, we're giving you
At
guys
least I
something
hope
to
they were
do
enjoying.
while you're stuck at home.
That's true.
Yeah, and for people out there listening, interact with us on social media. Send us questions that way, rather than watching one of these videos. We'd love to have actual questions listeners have to interact with, whether you come on and give us the question live, or whether you shoot it to us in advance on social media or in the YouTube comments at some point. We'll compile all those questions and do just a listener question and answer episode. I'd love to have that. So, I encourage people to interact every way you can. Give us criticism. We enjoy hearing that as well, because it's still interaction. So,
Yep.
All right. We'll do one more, and then we'll wrap it up if no questions come in.
Cancer right now, what's going to help you more, drugs or prayer? Let's say you had an amputation.
That was kind of the same, so I'm going to let us move on to this next one here.
Let's say you had an amputated limb. Would prayer ever bring it back? If you've heard stories about
amputated limb, is prayer going to bring it back?
I wouldn't expect it to.
Probably not.
Yeah. It's just, stuff happens, and, God could cause it to grow back if he wanted to, but I would see no reason why, why I would expect God to grow it back. He could if he wanted, but it's not something I would presume upon God. Christians also believe that sometimes things happen, for a reason, and not necessarily saying that God causes evil things to happen, but sometimes people go through difficult situations for some higher purpose, and so it may be that you might lose it in an accident, like an industrial accident or something, but as scripture says, God can bring any situation around for the good of those who love him. So if God doesn't regrow your limb, there might be some greater purpose that you could serve as someone who's gone through that experience.
Yeah, this isn't a difficult question for me as a cessationist, because whereas remission of cancer or something like that is a thing that could happen through natural means, the growth of a limb back is not something that could happen through natural means, so it would be a very obvious miracle rather than God acting through, circumstance and natural means to answer your prayer. And, as a cessationist, I don't really believe that kind of miracle happens in the current day. So I don't really have a problem with that. And I can show you miracles very similar to that happened prior to the closing of the authorship of Scripture. So, it shows that God could do something like that and would under those circumstances, but I don't think that's the kind of thing that would happen nowadays.
Yeah, Joel, I was thinking, for some reason I was hearing sensationalist when you were saying that, but I guess you were saying cessationist, as in you believe that the
cessationist
for today. Okay, yeah, I'm actually more of a cessationist myself. I still hold the possibility that God can still work miracles. He hasn't stopped doing that, but it's in His time. If He wants to do it, it's not something that I can just pray for and expect to happen, essentially. But
yeah,
but that's kind of my leaning too. So,
and I leaned very heavily cessationalist for a while. I reassessed that a little bit in light of personal experiences that I've seen of miracles that have occurred within my own life or those closely around me. And I've realized that I probably can't quite hold to that as much as I originally did, in light of what I have personally seen. And then, of course, the always referenced Craig Keener's work on miracles had some stuff that referred to restored limb function, not necessarily fully regrown limbs, but limbs that had completely lost function having instantly restored function. So I don't completely write it off. I'm very skeptical of those type of claims, but I don't completely write it off as a possibility if that miracle also served as some kind of sign or purpose. I think that's another one of the purposes of miracles, is that they're not just merely God doing something because he can or because people have asked him to. It's usually tied to either a spreading of the gospel or a direct message in some sense of this being the God of the Bible who is involved in a situation. So
yeah, and like I said, I'm just a cessationist in that I don't believe these sign gifts are for today. I still believe God can and likely does work miracles. Looking back in my own life, I can see that there is at least one miracle that I can point to that I've witnessed. So, I still believe God works miracles. I just don't think it's specifically a spiritual gift that He still grants for today.
Well, let me put it this way.
Why aren't? Go ahead.
Believe God has the power to work miracles. I don't hold out that He wouldn't possibly do it. I would say that most of the quote unquote miracles that you see are probably God using natural circumstances in order to answer prayers. Again, the very common one that you hear is when cancer goes into total remission after prayer. Was that God answering the prayer? Probably, but cancer can go into total remission with or without prayer. And I would say that God was probably using natural circumstances in order to answer that prayer. I'll give you an example. I was sitting down with a pastor of the church one time, and this particular pastor believed in, prophetic gifts and so forth, which I lean kind of against. And so he was telling me of a prophecy he had done once where, he was talking about the creation of Adam, and, at some point, some point he was making during that sermon he was talking about, so basically we're just dirt that walks. All right, so he says that, and then at the end of the sermon, this ex-con comes up, and the ex-con is just flabbergasted and shows him this tattoo, and the tattoo says dirt that walks. And the pastor said, okay, so explain that. How could I possibly have said that, at the same time this guy was there without some kind of prophetic gift? I was like, well, you could have said it coincidentally. And I'm not saying God wasn't involved in that coincidence, but I don't consider that a prophecy necessarily.
Right.
And so I believe God can work through coincidence and natural means. And I believe that's probably how he does work in this day and age. But, I could be wrong.
Well, that was an interesting dive into our various views. I think we've got a good representation of a spectrum of views here. Now we just need, a current Pentecostal in here to kind of complete this spectrum of views and tell us why we're all wrong.
Right.
Well, I'd be interested to get Mark's input on that as a self-proclaimed fundamentalist.
True.
Because I don't know where fundamentalists stand on this issue. I feel as if that's more of a Pentecostal issue.
Yeah. From what I understand, people still could fall on either side of the issue from a fundamentalist standpoint. But I don't know. I guess it just depends. Well, gentlemen, I think that's it. We got right to the 1 minute mark on this video, so this is one we can keep on the back burner and come back to maybe a little more if people enjoy it. If not, we'll find something else.
All right.
But we can hit on some more of those another day.
Yeah,
in the
given that we're all
meantime-
stuck at home, we might be able to do these videos more often.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I know I'll have time for hopefully a few additional live streams here and there. So if people want to watch, there should be opportunity to do so.
Yeah. Do you mind if I go ahead and mention podcast I'm doing tomorrow?
Yes, absolutely. Feel free. This is perfect time for plugs and
Yeah, since people are going to be sitting at home bored anyway, or unless you're working, of course, I guess. But yeah, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock on my personal podcast with my co-host Nathan Apodaca, we co-host a podcast called Pro-Life Thinking, which is specifically a pro-life podcast. But we talk about bioethics in general too. You can go to our Facebook page, Pro-Life Thinking. And like our page there, and you'll be able to find a link to our podcast. We're going to be doing a podcast tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We're going to be interviewing Fazale Rana on a book he published with Ken Samples last year called Humans 2.0, and the topic of the book is transhumanism. So our topic for discussion tomorrow will be transhumanism and his book Humans 2.0. So it will be a live discussion, which means that if you have questions, you can put them on the page, or you can call a number on the webpage as well to call in with questions that you might have. So yeah, if you've got nothing going on tomorrow at 10 Pacific, you can look us up there on the Facebook page and listen into our conversation with Fuz Rana or Fuzz Rana.
Okay.
that should be excellent. I heard his presentation on transhumanism last year, and it was really good. So I think people will enjoy that, especially if Black Mirror and shows like that interest you at all. Then it'll be worth listening to.
Yeah, if you've ever seen movies like Transcendence, very very dull movie, so I wouldn't blame you if you haven't seen it. Or movies like what was it, Gattaca, pertains to this. The Island is another one. Not so great a movie. It was more a Michael Bay film, but the first half of it was pretty good. But yeah, some movies like that kind of deal with transhumanist issues. And so yeah, it'll be an interesting discussion.
All right. Yeah, transhumanism is interesting.
All right. Any plugs from you, Joel?
Nope.
All right. Well, if you're not subscribed to the channel, be sure to click the little button that's going to pop up here after this video. Check out some of our other content. Let us know what you want to see more of, what you want to see less of. If we have to kick somebody off of these live streams, we'll do it if we have to. So, let us know, give us some feedback. We love hearing from people, and keep on watching and keep on mentioning. I'm going to roll our credits and we are going to be out.